The other day I was visiting a Warhammer shop because I wanted to pick up a model for a friend's birthday, and since I'm already there, I have to pick something up for myself, right? But I try to be reasonable in a situation like this. You don't want to give in to the call of the big boxes, you want to pick up something small and inexpensive. Let's be honest, most of the time I fail at that, but this time I actually managed to pick up something that fit my collection and didn't break the bank. There's this huge Death Guard army, kind of unpainted, sitting on my shelf, and there's a single model missing from that army, which is the Lord of Virulence. The shop happened to have it, so I thought, alright, so this is gonna be the next painting project. Hey guys, I'm Zoltan and you are watching PHLANS Miniatures. So this is the model right here, the Lord of Virulence from the Death Guard, and I will try to paint him something like this, so with mostly the original color scheme, but I'll try to go for something that is a bit more contrasty and, well, virulent in the end. Nothing Golden Demon level, but something that will stand out in my army and then I can also put into my display case. And since it's always a good thing to practice something with each of the models that you paint, I'm going to go for contrast this time. The main thing that I'm going to try to achieve is a nice contrasty model in the end. Since this is going to take me some time, I would say something like 15 hours or so for this model, I'm going to be breaking this down into 3 distinct videos. The first one is going to be about all the preparations, all the base coating, and then all the shading of the green armor. The second one is probably going to be about non-metallic metal painting, and the third about finishing touches and then the basing, of course. So with all that out of the way, let's slap some paint on this model. So the first step, as always, is to apply a primer, and I'm going for a black one here because black is just going to suit our purposes, you will see later. And I'm using it through the airbrush. Don't be discouraged if you don't have an airbrush. There's a lot of other ways you can actually apply this, and you should always have a primer on your model before you start painting, that's for sure. You can use a rattle can, which I have to admit I've never tried myself for some reason, but you can also just simply paint it on, and that's what I used to do before I got myself an airbrush. So I used the exact same primer, and I just took a brush and just applied the primer to the model, and it works perfectly fine. After the black primer, I'm applying a white Zenital Highlight, which is just a fancy way to say that I'm spraying the model white from the top. Right? You could be using something like a white ink, white primer even, or a white paint. I'm just using a white primer because it's easy. And the idea is that you are, on the one hand, kind of simulating where the light is hitting the model, right? I'm not really very specific with this. You don't have to be very careful, at least not the way we are using it now. I'm just spraying the model really white from the top as much as possible, because the second thing I wanted to do is to help with applying the base coat. The idea is that by the time we are finished with this, we are going to have black, let's say dark gray at least, in the shadows, and then everything on the top should be white, and this will make our initial base coating process much easier. It will be a bit counterproductive to what we want to do later with non-metallic metal, but we will fix that with a little bit of brushwork. Alternatively, you can also just skip this step and you can just do everything on the black primer. It will make it a little bit more difficult to apply the base coat for the green, but otherwise you are still going to be fine. So now that we have finished with the primer, let's actually do some real paint work and put some green on this model. So this is where a lot of people already start struggling, and I have to admit that I was too when I first started painting, because here is where you first encounter the problem of what kind of paint consistency you really need to apply a base coat. And unfortunately there is really no easy answer to this, because it depends on a lot of different factors. It depends on the paint you are using as well, and also on the model. Like for example, our model is now Zenital Highlighted, supposedly, right? And that means that because the underlying layer is white and the paint is transparent to a certain extent, we are going to be able to relatively easily cover it and then achieve a nice smooth coat. The rule of thumb is that you don't want to use paint out of the pot here. You need to add a little bit of water to it, and you don't necessarily have to cover everything fully if you have a Zenital Highlight, but especially on the white areas, you have to achieve full coverage so that it looks nice and vibrant, because if you don't, you are just going to use all the saturation and all the vibrancy. So go for a full coat on the top parts of the model, and then if it's not fully covering everything in the shadow areas, that's fine, because we are going to be shading that anyway. The other interesting thing that I see from people all the time, and even friends who are also painting Warhammer asking me about this, is brush size. Because I remember when I first started, you have this tendency that you want to go really small with your brushes, because the model is small, right? So it just makes a lot of sense. But it doesn't really, right? And especially for base coating, you don't need a good brush. You don't need something really nice and perfect. What you need is something that you can still control well enough. And then if you make a couple of mistakes, that's going to be easy to fix later on. So ideally you go for a bigger brush, something that is like in relatively good condition but not too great. As you can see, mine is a little bit already fraying on the top or at the tip, but it's still good enough for this, and it holds enough paint that I can just cover everything and I don't take forever to actually do it. One more thing to consider is also that you want to always brush away from the shadow areas, especially when you have a Zenital highlight like this. So as I told you before, we want to cover the white areas, so the top areas of the model. So I just start my brush strokes from the shadow areas, and I go towards the top, towards the white, because when you deposit the paint, there's always going to be more pigment, so more coverage where you stop your stroke and less where you start it, right? And because we don't really want to cover the shadows too much, we actually want it to be darker. This actually just aligns perfectly with what we want to achieve. Since we are doing a non-metallic metal later on this model, what we want to do is we want to cover everything. So we want to cover the green armor, we want to cover the fleshy bits, and we also want to cover all the wiggly bits, you know, the purple tentacles, at least in my interpretation, they're going to be purple. And then finally, everything else that is going to be some kind of metal, we want to keep black. So once we covered everything with flesh and green and purple, we'll just make everything black again. So as you can see, we are retracing our steps a little bit. We already ruined this black when we applied the Zenital, and I knew that, but you know, like I still think that I benefited from the Zenital highlight enough that it makes it worthwhile actually just doing this at this stage and make everything that needs to be metallic black again. And the actual reason why we need this to be black is because that's just gonna serve us as our like base color for the non-metallic pieces. You could start from the middle, right? So you would use the middle color that you want to use for the non-metallic metal, and then you both highlight and shade from there. But I usually do it in a way that I start from black and then just highlight from there. So this is just an easy first step for both the steel and also for the goldish, bronzish thing that we want to use for the trims on this guy. So now that we have most of our main colors on the model, because we have 4 really, we have green, we have flesh, we have purple, and the blacks for all the non-metallics, and well, mostly black also for all the other colors that we're going to be using in smaller quantities, like for example the red for the eyelenses. Now it's time to do something a little bit more fancy and also more fun, right? Because up until this point it was relatively boring just painting between the lines. So here I'm starting to shade the model, and the idea here is that we want to create contrast. The reason why we need to do that is because this model is relatively small. It's pretty big actually for a Space Marine or Chaos Space Marine, but still relatively small. And that means that your eyes will immediately see, just by looking at it, that this is not normal scale. It will never look like a big Space Marine, but it will be pretty obvious it's actually a small thing. So to trick your eyes into thinking this is actually a much bigger thing, so this is not just a 5 centimeter tall model, but an actual 3 meter tall Terminator, we need to exaggerate all those highlights way more and those shadows so that your eyes perceive it as something in a different scale than it actually is. So in order to achieve this, I will be trying to paint the volumes of the model, which means that if something is a cylinder, we are going to highlight it as you would actually see a cylinder, you know, like in real life, as the light hits it, and certain areas are going to be in shadow and other areas are going to be lighter. We will do something like at least an approximation of this so that it looks something really contrasty, something really believable and cool in the end. Or so I hope, at least. So this is the theory, but in practice what we're going to be using is a glaze. And the glaze is just very, very thin paint. Well, depending on how thin you want to make it, I suppose, for a specific purpose. It's definitely way thinner. It has way more water in it than something that you would use for base coating, because the idea is that less pigment means that it stains the surface less, so you can create a transition, and you will be seeing this from me while I'm like just brushing away from the light areas towards the shadow areas. So in even more practical terms, what I'm doing is I am loading my brush with pre-thinned paints that I already watered down on the wet palette to the right consistency, and then I'm removing most of the water before actually touching the model on the paper towel, so that I'm left with a little bit of water and a little bit of pigment, and then I am applying that once again from the light areas, brushing towards the dark areas, and then I'm just applying multiple layers of this. So once again, the idea here is that we deposit the pigments where we end the stroke. So you end the stroke in the dark areas if you want to make it darker, and you end the stroke in the light areas if you want to make it lighter, if you're highlighting. And every layer starts a little bit further towards the dark area, so that we create this transition. If you just brush over and over again from the same area, obviously then you're just going to cover the same area, right? And then there's going to be a very stark dividing line between the original color and then what you are applying. But if you actually just gradually go lower and lower, closer to the dark, so smaller and smaller area is actually covered by the glaze, then there's going to be this transition, and it's going to be darker at the darkest, or like the deepest shadow, and less dark towards the highlights, obviously. You might be also asking yourself, why the hell am I actually using purple here? And the reason for that is because of color theory, and I don't pretend to be an expert on it, but purple is just a really nice shadow color for green. If you look at the color wheel, you are going to see that they are kind of opposite each other, and it just makes for a really nice shadow, just the same way as, for example, red is a really nice shadow for blue, believe it or not, and that's what I'm using for my ultramarines. There's one more benefit to the purple here, which is that it's another color that we're going to have on other parts of the model as well. So it's going to just help us with consistency and coherency of the model, I suppose. It will also make for a lot of coldness in the model, which is something that I'm going to have to fight later on, but that's fine. That's just going to help us even more with contrast if we have some cold parts, and then I'm going to have a lot of warm colors somewhere else. And now that we are happy with our shadows, and you can probably already see that the model has way more contrast because of them, but now we are going to push it. We are going to push it with highlights, and we are going to be using the quotation marks normal paints for this, so the Citadel paints that you would associate with Death Guard, because they're just really unique and really, really nice. And we're going to be using the same glazing technique, but this time, instead of going from the middle color towards the shadows, we're going to go the opposite way. We're going from the middle color, so Death Guard green, towards the brightest areas on top mostly of the model and the shapes. And we are going to be depositing the paints with the last brush stroke when lifting the brush on top of the model. With the highlights, we also have another duty that we need to fulfill, and that we didn't really have to care about too much with the shadows, and that's edge highlights. So in order to make something that is kind of shiny, like especially metal, but also this burnished kind of armor, you need to also make the edges of it lighter than anything else. It's just how materials work, right, in real life, and this is something we need to simulate here to make it believable. And yes, I know this is not the traditional heavy metal style of painting, but yes, we are still going to be using a lot of edge highlights, because that's just an essential part of painting miniatures, and especially for the non-metallic metal parts, we're going to be using them a lot. So yeah, it's just something you have to get better at, and I have to get better at as well. My tip for this, and you will see me using this a lot here in this video, is just make the paint a little bit thicker, almost like base coat consistency, and then use the side of the brush as much as possible, or the side of the tip of the brush at least, to hit that edge that you want to paint, and try to not paint it with the tip of the brush as you would anything else, because at least for me, that just results in catastrophe usually. And this is how it should look like once you have finished with the shadows and the highlights. Well, I say finished, but mostly finished, right? We are going to work more on the armor once you see more of the colors around it, and then we will see how saturated it actually is. I can already tell you it's not saturated enough, so we will be fixing that a little bit later on. But for now, at least, we are finished with shading and highlighting this really big step, and all the green that was supposed to be shaded and highlighted is now finished. So as you can see, or maybe you already spotted it while you were watching the footage, unfortunately I left out one detail, which is this little shield. I'm pretty sure it has a specific name, on the shoulder of the Terminator, and unfortunately I really want that to be green as well, and because it's green it has to also be highlighted and shaded. So since I missed this little detail, now we have to do a little montage to actually show you how I did every single step that I did before for this tiny part, and it actually took me a long time to do. The moral of the story is that when you are doing your base coats, make sure that you spot everything, that you actually plan the whole thing. Okay, so those things are going to be green, those things are going to be purple or whatever color, right? Because if you miss out on the base coat, then you just have to redo everything. And the more complicated your scheme, the more complicated the steps. So now with the shield done as well, this is actually how the model should look, with everything green. Now finally, really everything green, highlighted and shaded. And with that, we reached the end of this first video. There is 2 more to come. The second one is going to be mostly about non-metallic metal, and then the third one is going to be the finishing touches and also the basing. Let me know if you guys have any questions or comments so far. I'll try to answer as many as I can. And, well, you know the drill on YouTube. If you like the content, please like, subscribe, hit the bell button, because then you will know when the next video is up. See you in the next one, and in the meantime, let's work on that pile of shame.